You think you can just walk into Barbetta like you own the place? This isn't your kind of restaurant? Those harsh, biting words struck Dr. Naomi Ellis and her 14-year-old daughter, Diane, like a slap in the face as they stood at the entrance of New York's elegant Barbetta restaurant. The sting of those words lingered, but what happened next would leave an unforgettable mark on everyone involved. Before we begin this story of quiet justice, where are you watching from? Comment below, like, and subscribe. Now, let's step into an evening that changed everything. It was a mild spring evening in Manhattan, just cool enough to wear a light coat, just warm enough for the city's sidewalk cafes to glow with early diners. The sky had taken on a soft lavender hue as the sun dipped behind the skyline. Naomi Ellis, a woman known in corporate circles for her quiet brilliance and unwavering ethics, had cleared her calendar for one thing: to take her daughter Diane out to celebrate her 14th birthday. Diane had just returned from her first academic term abroad, an accelerated arts and language program in Switzerland. Naomi had missed her terribly. But more than that, she had wanted this night to be something special, not lavish or loud, just the kind of memory that lingers, something elegant, peaceful, and meaningful. She chose Barbetta for its old-world charm and its garden courtyard, which she had read about in a travel article years ago. The place was legendary, serving classic Northern Italian cuisine since the early 1900s. Naomi had made the reservation under her middle name, Eliza, a habit she had picked up long ago after noticing that using her full name and title often changed how people treated her. She wanted this night to be normal, not about power or position or image, just a mother and her daughter enjoying a meal together. They arrived right on time. Naomi wore a tailored beige trench coat over a soft black blouse and dark slacks, with her hair pinned in a neat, low bun. Diane wore a pale blue wrap dress with her favorite gold pendant, a birthday gift from her late grandmother. They smiled as they approached the host stand just inside the entrance. It was Diane who noticed the hostess stiffen first, the way her eyes narrowed slightly, the pause in her posture. Naomi saw it too, but she said nothing. "We have a reservation for two," Naomi said with calm warmth. "Under Eliza Ellis." The hostess, a woman in her late 20s named Jessica, glanced at the list, tapped a few keys, and gave a tight smile. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't see that name on the list." Naomi politely showed her the confirmation email. Jessica barely glanced at it. "That might have been made through an old system. We've updated our booking platform. Unfortunately, we're fully committed this evening. We do have a cancellation list if you'd like to leave your number." Before Naomi could respond, a voice called from the side. Another employee, a young man in a black suit, Kyle, the assistant manager, had been watching. He stepped closer, glanced at Diane, then said those words that would change everything. "You think you can just walk into Barbetta like you own the place? This isn't your kind of restaurant?" Naomi froze. Diane's mouth parted, eyes wide. The restaurant lobby had gone quiet. A couple seated nearby looked up from their menus. No one laughed. No one intervened. Kyle said nothing else. He simply gave a short nod, turned his back, and walked away. Naomi looked down at her daughter, whose hands now gripped the strap of her purse like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Let's go," she said softly. They stepped outside. The air felt colder, not from the weather, but from the weight of what had just happened. Diane walked in silence for a block before whispering, "Why did he say that to us?" Naomi didn't answer at first. She looked up at the rows of townhouses glowing in the twilight, then down at her daughter. "Because some people don't see what's in front of them," she finally said. "They see what they've been taught to expect, and we didn't fit." They took a cab home. Naomi didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. But something inside her had shifted, not out of anger, but out of responsibility. That evening wasn't just about a ruined dinner or a missed reservation. It was about her daughter, standing there, being dismissed, humiliated, and silenced without cause. It was about the quiet message that had been delivered loud and clear. You don't belong here. But Naomi Ellis had spent her life turning those kinds of messages inside out. She hadn't built a billion-dollar investment firm to teach the world a lesson, but when the world gave her the chance, she didn't waste it. What happened the next morning would ripple far beyond Barbetta's walls. But on that night, all Diane knew was that her mother held her hand tighter, and that her silence, calm, steady, and focused, wasn't retreat. It was the sound of something powerful about to unfold. The next morning, long before the sun had fully stretched itself across the New York skyline, Dr. Naomi Ellis was already seated at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of dark roast in one hand and her phone in the other. Diane was still asleep down the hall, wrapped in the calm of morning dreams, unaware that her mother had been up most of the night, not with rage, but with purpose. The events at Barbetta still echoed in Naomi's mind, not in sharp flashes of anger, but in the heavy quiet that followed humiliation. She could still hear the hostess's carefully chosen words. She could still feel the shift in Diane's hand when the assistant manager had spoken as if they were trespassers in a world not meant for them. And she could still see the eyes of every silent bystander in that restaurant. People who saw everything, but said nothing. Naomi didn't intend to respond with noise or confrontation. That had never been her way. Her strength didn't live in raised voices. It lived in what happened after. She opened her contacts list and tapped a name. Laura Bennett. Her longtime executive assistant and the woman who had stood beside her through mergers, board battles, and billion-dollar negotiations. Laura picked up on the first ring. Yes. Dr. Ellis, she said, always formal in tone, but never cold. Naomi spoke calmly. I need you to pull the Barbetta file, everything we have, ownership structure, investment history, who's managing the expansion on our end. There was a pause. Understood, Laura said, her voice tightening slightly. May I ask why? Naomi let out a breath. Because we're not staying quiet about last night, not this time, and I want the facts before I act. By mid-morning, the information had arrived in Naomi's inbox. Barbetta, though family-owned for over a century, had recently entered a partnership with Rochfield Partners, a global hospitality group. Just 6 months ago, Rochfield had approached Ellis Equity, Naomi's firm, with a proposal, a $75 million expansion fund to elevate Barbetta and a few of its sister properties into a boutique luxury chain. The paperwork had been drafted, due diligence was underway, but no deal had been signed. Naomi, who held a controlling stake in the Ellis-Rochfield partnership, still had full authority to pause or withdraw. She didn't hesitate. She drafted a short, direct message to James Carter, the CEO of Rochfield and a man who had flown from London to New York 3 times in the last year just to court her confidence. She kept it brief. James, we need to talk. Something's come to light about Barbetta's frontline culture. I'm putting our involvement on hold until further notice. I expect transparency and a swift internal response. Within an hour. Her phone buzzed. James, calling directly. She let it ring twice before answering. Naomi, he said, breathless. I just saw your note. What happened? Naomi didn't raise her voice. Your staff happened, or rather, their behavior. I was at Barbetta last night with my daughter. I was turned away, humiliated, and spoken to like I didn't belong. No one recognized me. That's not the problem. The problem is that they assumed, based solely on how I looked, that I didn't deserve to be there. James was silent. Naomi continued. You know I don't pull strings for attention, but if that's how they treat people who look like me, imagine how many others have been quietly dismissed, disrespected, or dehumanized. James exhaled. I'm deeply sorry. I had no idea. I don't need an apology, Naomi said gently. I need accountability. Your team will need to review staff conduct, retraining, and oversight. But I also want you to understand, this isn't about one bad employee. It's about a system of assumptions. That system cost your restaurant a moment my daughter will never forget, and not in the way I intended. James cleared his throat. What would you like me to do? Do the right thing, she replied. Start with your people, then we can talk business. They hung up. Naomi sat in stillness for a moment, the kind of silence that doesn't scream, but settles deep. It wasn't about revenge. It never had been. She could have called the media, blasted the story on social platforms, or named names in public. But that wasn't Naomi. She didn't believe in public spectacle. She believed in structural correction. And she knew her influence didn't come from her name. It came from what she chose to do with it. By noon, Laura informed her that Barbetta's management team had been alerted to an internal review. The regional director of operations for Rochfield, a man named Robert Kane, had called for a full investigation. Staff rosters, security footage, and reservation logs were being pulled. Naomi didn't ask for it. She didn't have to. Her silence, backed by her decision to halt the funding, spoke louder than any press release ever could. Later that evening, Diane came into the kitchen, still in her socks, carrying a book and a quiet question in her eyes. Did you do something? She asked. About last night? Naomi looked at her daughter, not just at her face, but at the small hurt that still lingered behind her words. I didn't yell, she said softly. I didn't argue, but I made a few calls. Diane nodded slowly, then sat across from her. Did they listen? Naomi smiled, tired but sure. They will. They sat for a while in silence, the kind only a mother and daughter can share after a hard truth. Naomi reached over, took Diane's hand, and held it. No grand speech, no dramatic vow, just presence. Just the quiet assurance that some battles are fought in boardrooms, not on sidewalks. That some victories don't roar. They hum beneath the surface until real change begins. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Somewhere across town, Barbetta's evening service was beginning. Menus were being opened, wine glasses polished. But inside Naomi's home, something more powerful was already in motion. She wasn't done. Not yet. But the quiet storm had begun. The next 48 hours unfolded like a slow unraveling, not with headlines or hashtags, but with hushed emails, emergency meetings, and a quiet scramble behind the scenes. At Barbetta. The atmosphere shifted the moment the regional director arrived. Robert Kane, a tall, silver-haired man in his late 50s who had built his career managing luxury properties across Europe and the East Coast. He wasn't the type to rattle easily. But when he reviewed the footage from the night Naomi and Diane were turned away, even his expression faltered. He watched as Naomi calmly presented her reservation, as the hostess dismissed her without reading it, and as Kyle, the assistant manager, made his careless, stinging comment. There was no yelling, no scene, just a mother and her child quietly leaving, faces composed, backs straight, dignity intact. But it was clear to anyone watching what had happened. Assumptions had been made, bias had been acted upon, and it wasn't just an embarrassing mistake. It was a liability. Robert called an immediate staff meeting the following morning, requiring every employee who had been present that night to report to the upstairs conference room. The energy in the room was nervous, guarded. Jessica, the hostess, sat stiffly with her arms crossed. Kyle leaned against the wall, trying to appear indifferent. David Holt, the floor manager, glanced at the closed door, as if calculating whether this would blow over or blow up. Robert didn't waste time. He played the security clip on the large monitor mounted at the front of the room. For 2 minutes, no one spoke. The room was silent, except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the sound of Naomi's voice in the clip. Calm, precise, firm. "Under Eliza Ellis," she had said. "Yes, I have the confirmation email right here." And then Kyle's words rang out again, echoing in the now tense room. "This isn't your kind of restaurant?" When the footage ended, Robert paused, turned, and faced the room. "Does anyone here wish to explain what we just watched?" he asked. No one moved. Jessica shifted in her seat. Kyle stared at the floor. David opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally. Robert set the remote down and clasped his hands. "The woman you turned away is Dr. Naomi Ellis. She is the CEO of Ellis Equity and the lead investor behind the Rochfield expansion project. She was here, privately, with her daughter for a family dinner, and she left without incident. Because you made her feel unwelcome, because of how she looked, not what she said, not how she behaved, but because of how she appeared to you." That silence, the kind that stretches so tight it nearly hums, hung over the room like fog. Jessica blinked slowly. "We didn't know who she was," she said quietly. "That's the problem." Robert replied, "You shouldn't have to know who someone is in order to treat them with basic respect." Kyle scoffed lightly under his breath, but Robert turned to him. "You used language that was inappropriate, unprofessional, and frankly discriminatory. And you did it in front of a child," Kyle muttered. "I was just trying to keep the tone of the place intact." Robert's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "Your tone has cost this location more than you realize." Within the hour, Jessica and Kyle were both placed on immediate leave pending termination. David Holt, who had been present but had done nothing to intervene, submitted his resignation. The remaining staff were given retraining schedules and placed under temporary supervision across town. Naomi received a call, not from Robert, and not from James Carter in London, but from Isabel Fontana, the matriarchal owner of Barbetta herself, at 83 years old. Isabel rarely involved herself in the day-to-day anymore, having entrusted operations to partners and management firms. But when she learned what had happened, and to whom, she made one call and asked for Dr. Ellis's private number. Naomi was in her office, reviewing sustainability reports. When the phone rang, she didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway. "Dr. Ellis," the voice said gently, with the unmistakable lilt of northern Italy. "This is Isabel Fontana. May I speak with you? Woman to woman?" Naomi paused. "Of course. I heard what happened at my restaurant." Isabel continued. "I watched it. I've never been more ashamed of something done under my family's name. I can't change what happened to you, but I wanted you to hear this from me. It was wrong, and I am deeply sorry." Naomi was quiet for a moment. She had been expecting statements, not sincerity. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." Isabel took a breath. "May I invite you and your daughter back, as my guests, just the two of you? No press, no attention, just a meal that should have happened the first time." Naomi smiled softly. "I appreciate the invitation, but I think the lesson was already served." Isabel let out a warm, rueful laugh. "Fair enough, but know this. What you did, with such grace, has changed the conversation here. It won't be ignored again." They hung up. Naomi sat back in her chair, eyes thoughtful. She wasn't looking for revenge. She never had been. She wanted something much harder to earn. Acknowledgement. not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been turned away, doubted, or dismissed based on nothing but skin and silence. Across the city, in boardrooms and inboxes, her name now carried more than reputation. It carried proof. That change doesn't always come with headlines. Sometimes, it walks in quietly, gets turned away, and still manages to change the whole room. And somewhere in that restaurant, beneath the clink of wine glasses and the flicker of lanterns, the memory of that moment, the one where they got it so wrong, would linger, not as a wound, but as a warning. The storm had not been loud, but it had arrived. The story might have ended there. Quiet consequences behind closed doors, apologies exchanged between professionals, reputations salvaged in private. But stories like this rarely stay hidden for long. It was never Naomi's intention to go public. She hadn't posted a tweet, made a statement, or so much as mentioned Barbetta's name to the press. But truth has a way of finding light, especially when silence lingers too long. It started with a single post, buried in a local neighborhood group online, written not by Naomi, but by a woman named Priya Sharma, who had been dining at Barbetta that same night. She hadn't heard the entire interaction, but she had seen the moment Naomi and Diane were turned away. What struck her wasn't the words, but the expressions, the way Naomi stood still, dignified, shielding her daughter not with anger, but with presence. In her post, Priya wrote, "There was something about that moment, about the quiet shame in the girl's eyes and the calm restraint in her mother's. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like something deeper and wrong." She didn't name names. She simply described what she saw. But within 24 hours, the comment section had exploded. Other patrons began chiming in. One woman recalled noticing how no one at Barbetta that night looked like her. A former server, under anonymity, admitted that the staff had long maintained unspoken codes about who was allowed in the garden. Then someone shared that they had recognized the woman in the blue dress. "She's the CEO of Ellis Equity," they wrote. "I met her at a youth entrepreneurship summit last year. Brilliant, kind. She spoke about legacy and leadership. That's her." Suddenly, the story had a name, and once Naomi's name surfaced, the press followed. It wasn't tabloid-style coverage, no clickbait headlines, just quiet reporting from respected local journalists who asked the right questions about hospitality standards, unconscious bias, and the dignity of all guests, regardless of title, attire, or tone. But what truly turned attention to the heart of the story wasn't Naomi. It was Diane. At first, she didn't want to talk about it. She was just a teenager, after all, more comfortable with books and paints than microphones. But then, one afternoon, as Naomi was preparing for a conference call, Diane sat beside her at the kitchen table, holding a draft of a school speech she had been assigned to write on "A Moment That Changed Your View of the World." Naomi looked up. "You want me to read it?" Diane nodded. "Only if you promise not to edit anything." Naomi smiled and began to read. The first line stopped her cold. "My name is Diane Ellis, and I used to believe that the world saw me the way my mother does." It was a short, honest piece, no grand statements, no dramatics, just a 14-year-old girl putting words to something many adults struggle to name: the pain of being unseen. She described the restaurant not by name, but by feel. She described the look on the hostess's face, the way the floor beneath her feet suddenly felt foreign, and the moment she realized that, sometimes, people don't need to know who you are to decide you don't belong. "That night," she wrote, "I learned something important, that my mother is powerful, not because people respect her title, but because she doesn't need one to stand up for what's right. She never raised her voice. She never lost her grace. But she didn't disappear either. She showed me how to carry silence like a shield. Naomi finished reading and looked up, eyes shining. "This is beautiful," she said softly. Diane shrugged. "It's just what I felt." Naomi squeezed her hand. "It's more than that. It's the truth." Diane's teacher was so moved by the piece, she asked permission to share it with a local educator's blog focused on youth perspectives. Naomi hesitated, then said yes. If her daughter was ready to speak, she wasn't going to hold her back. Within days, Diane's speech was reposted across parenting forums, educational pages, and diversity newsletters. No names were attached to the restaurant, but readers didn't need them. What moved people wasn't the drama. It was the stillness. The image of a teenage girl, standing beside her mother, learning what dignity looks like in real time. That was the story that resonated. It wasn't about lawsuits or outrage. It was about legacy, about what children learn not by what we say, but by how we carry ourselves when no one claps. Naomi received emails from mothers in Detroit, pastors in Georgia, grandmothers in Missouri. One woman wrote, "My daughter and I were asked if we were guests or just looking around at a boutique last year. I didn't speak up. I wish I had. You gave me courage." Naomi never responded publicly, but she read every word. She folded Diane's speech and kept it in her planner, right next to her notes on her firm's new mentorship initiative. She knew then that the moment at Barbetta, ugly as it was, had become something else entirely. A spark, not of revenge, but of renewal. It had opened a conversation that was too often whispered and too easily dismissed. And it had started not with a headline, but with a look, a pause, a refusal to lower her eyes, and a daughter who had seen everything. Now, she wasn't just raising a child. She was passing down a way of being, a way of moving through the world with both humility and unshakable worth. One day, Diane would face her own moments of being judged, but she would not flinch. She would remember the restaurant, the words, the silence, and the woman who stood beside her without ever needing to shout. And that, Naomi thought, might be the real legacy she was building after all. The email came on a quiet Thursday morning, sandwiched between quarterly board updates and an internal memo about Ellis Equity's new mentorship accelerator. Naomi almost deleted it without reading. It looked like just another piece of PR damage control. But the subject line stopped her. Formal proposal from the Barbetta Leadership Committee, @TN, Dr. Naomi Ellis. She opened it slowly, expecting more apology language, maybe a tone-deaf offer for a private chef's tasting, or an invitation to dine discreetly as our honored guest. But what she found was different. This wasn't just a note. It was a document, cleanly formatted, deeply considered, and signed by 6 senior leaders across Rochfield Partners and Barbetta Holdings, including Robert Kane and Isabel Fontana herself. The opening paragraph expressed sincere regret, not just for the incident, but for what it revealed, a systemic lapse in the culture of hospitality, one that had, in their words, allowed quiet prejudice to pass as professional discretion. Naomi read that line twice. It wasn't the kind of phrasing people used when they were trying to protect liability. It was something else, a real admission. The proposal that followed was both unexpected and oddly personal. They weren't offering a public donation. They weren't asking her to endorse them. They were asking her to lead them, specifically. They invited her to become a strategic advisor in a new initiative across all Rochfield properties, a multi-phase transformation in staff training, guest experience, and internal accountability. They called it the Ellis Standard, not to flatter her, but to honor what her silence had exposed. The goal, as they laid it out, was to rebuild how staff were taught to perceive and receive every person who walked through their doors, not based on clothing, speech, or skin, but based on presence, humanity, and merit. They asked her to help shape it from the inside. They would provide funding, a dedicated team, and full editorial control. Naomi set her phone down and stared out the window. Spring had begun to warm the sidewalks below, the first hints of green pushing through the dull edges of city planters. She didn't smile. Not yet. She just breathed, long and steady. For all her years in business, no one had ever offered her a seat at the table like this, not out of tokenism, not because they needed her name on a website, but because they had failed, and they knew it. And more than that, they believed she could help make it right. Still, Naomi didn't respond right away. She needed to think, not about her reputation or their sincerity, but about what it would cost her to say yes. Reform is rarely easy, especially when you're not asking for it, and suddenly, it's handed to you. That night, she sat across from Diane at the dinner table, not over candlelight or five-star menus, but over baked chicken and roasted carrots. Something simple, something warm. Diane was finishing a geometry worksheet when Naomi quietly slid the proposal across the table. "What's this?" Diane asked, setting her pencil down. "An invitation," Naomi said. "From the people who turned us away." Diane read the first few lines, eyes scanning faster as the meaning set in. "Wait, they want you to fix it?" Naomi nodded. "They're asking me to design a new standard for how guests are treated, how staff are trained, across all their restaurants, not just Barbetta." Diane leaned back. "Are you going to do it?" Naomi folded her hands. "What do you think?" Diane paused. Then she said something that surprised them both. "I think they're lucky you're even thinking about it." Naomi smiled softly. "You think I should?" Diane shrugged. "You don't need to prove anything, but maybe they need someone like you to remind them what they forgot." That sentence stayed with Naomi for the rest of the night. Maybe they do need someone like her. And maybe the only reason she had the power to say no was because she had earned the power to say yes. The next morning, she wrote her reply. She didn't accept immediately. Instead, she outlined 3 non-negotiables. First, the initiative wouldn't bear her name unless it resulted in actual, measurable structural change. Second, it must include a rotating advisory board made up of diverse voices, former employees, young professionals, and everyday patrons from all walks of life. And third, she insisted that Diane, and young people like her, be consulted in at least one round of the review. "This isn't just about me," she wrote. "It's about who's watching, and what they'll carry with them after we're gone." She hit send. Later that week, her calendar filled with video calls, planners, consultants, trainers, executives. For once, no one interrupted her. No one tried to over-explain the goals or water down the vision. They listened, and they took notes. On her second call with Isabel Fontana, the elder restaurateur said something Naomi would never forget. "I've spent a lifetime building walls of tradition around our restaurant. I never realized how many people we kept outside those walls. I'm grateful you had the courage to walk away, and the grace to come back." Naomi didn't reply immediately. She just nodded. Not everything needs words. Some changes begin not with speeches, but with someone willing to stand still, while the rest of the room shifts around her. And now, the room was shifting. It wasn't about revenge. It never had been. And yet, as Naomi stood just outside the ivy-covered gates of Barbetta 1 month later, she couldn't ignore the weight of the moment. The early evening air was warm, brushed with spring rain. and the lanterns in the garden had already begun to glow, a soft amber light cascading over white linens and freshly bloomed lilacs. This time, there was no line, no questions, no assumptions. A different hostess stood at the door, one Naomi had personally helped train through the new pilot of the Ellis standard, and when their eyes met, the woman smiled and said, "Dr. Ellis, your table is ready. We've been expecting you." Naomi nodded, gracious but calm, and stepped through the wrought iron gate, Diane walking just behind her. It wasn't an event. There were no cameras, no shareholders, just 2 seats reserved beneath the lights in the same garden courtyard where, weeks earlier, they had been told, without apology, that they didn't belong. Naomi had declined every public speaking offer since the story surfaced. She had no interest in fanfare. Her work had always been about infrastructure, changing systems, not staging performances. But the Barbetta team had quietly extended one final invitation, not as a stunt, but as a gesture, to see, firsthand, how her guidance had taken root. She agreed, on one condition, that the evening be shared with the people who made the change possible. And so, seated not far from Naomi and Diane that evening, were 3 new trainees who had just completed the inaugural Ellis Standard Hospitality Program, Maya Lopez, a first-generation college student and aspiring manager, Travis Yates, a soft-spoken culinary school graduate who had nearly walked away from the industry after being passed over for promotions he was told he wasn't polished enough to handle, and Sophia Lynn, a former server who had once been accused of being too opinionated to lead, now rehired and being mentored directly by Robert Kane. The dinner wasn't extravagant. There were no nameplates or printed speeches, just quiet conversation, honest stories, and a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Staff moved through the space with intention, not just efficiency, but empathy. Each guest was greeted by name when possible, and no one was overlooked. Naomi watched the rhythm of it, not as an owner, but as someone who had once been invisible here. She noticed small things, how water glasses were refilled with care, how a guest in a worn jacket was offered the same warmth as the couple wearing custom tailoring. And then, halfway through the meal, something unexpected happened. A young busser, no more than 19, approached their table with trembling hands and a small envelope. I'm sorry to interrupt," he said softly, eyes wide. "But I read about you, and I just wanted to say thank you. I got this job through the new program you helped start. I've never worked anywhere like this before, where I feel seen." He set the envelope on the table, nodded once, and hurried away. Naomi opened it. Inside was a note written in careful handwriting. "You changed more than a restaurant. You gave people like me a place to stand." Naomi blinked slowly, folded the note, and placed it gently in her purse next to Diane's school speech. Across from her, Diane had gone quiet, her eyes misty. "Mom," she said after a pause, "I don't think I've ever seen a place change like this." "Not really." Naomi gave a small smile. "Change doesn't always look loud. Sometimes. It looks like someone holding the door open. Who wouldn't have?" Before, in the corner of the courtyard, Robert Kane stood quietly, watching, not hovering, just present. He wasn't there to take credit. He had learned something too, that corporate apology statements meant little without follow-through, and that the true test of leadership wasn't in salvaging image, but in surrendering control to voices more honest than your own. As dessert was cleared and the garden began to empty, Naomi rose. She hadn't planned to speak, but the moment, like the air, was full of quiet meaning. She stood at her table and raised her glass. Not high, not for spectacle, just enough. The nearby tables turned toward her naturally, drawn by the stillness. "I wasn't sure I'd ever come back here," she began, her voice calm, clear. "But I did, not to relive what happened, but to see what could grow from it." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of guests, staff, and young workers who had once doubted they belonged in places like this. This restaurant didn't just change its policy, it changed its posture. And in doing that, it made room, not just for me, but for so many others who come through these doors with quiet dignity and high hopes. She paused. You don't need to know someone's title to offer them respect. You just need to remember they're human. That's the heart of good service. And the heart of good leadership, too. There was no applause, only a deep stillness, followed by a wave of understanding that rippled across the garden like wind through leaves. Naomi sat back down. Diane reached for her hand. "You didn't even have to raise your voice," she whispered. Naomi smiled. "Power doesn't live in the volume," she said. "It lives in the choices we make when no one's clapping." That night, as they stepped out of Barbetta once more, there was no sting in the air, no shame, only a quiet, full-circle sense that something had been rebuilt, not just a policy, not just a reputation, but a shared understanding. The same walls that once kept people out now had open doors, and inside those doors were new faces, new standards, and a new kind of welcome. Weeks passed. The story faded from headlines, as stories always do, replaced by louder events and flashier scandals. But for those who had been part of it, for the servers quietly retrained, the guests who had read Diane's speech, the staff who had been humbled and reshaped by Naomi's quiet resistance, it never truly disappeared. And for Diane, who had stepped into adolescence with eyes wide open, it had become part of her foundation. Life returned to its rhythm. Naomi went back to her work, reviewing proposals, mentoring young founders, shaping strategies behind glass walls and quiet conference calls. But something had changed in her, not in how she spoke or how she moved, but in what she carried with her. A clarity, a deep, settled understanding that her role in this world wasn't just about building wealth or closing deals. It was about widening the path, quietly, steadily, for those coming behind her. One morning, as the city stirred beneath a pale blue sky, Naomi found herself standing in Diane's room, looking at the framed letter on her desk. It was the speech Diane had written, the one she had turned into her school, the one that had traveled further than they'd ever imagined. Naomi had printed and framed it without telling her, not as a trophy, but as a marker. A reminder of the night her daughter found her voice, not by shouting, but by noticing, and then choosing to speak. That evening, Naomi and Diane walked to a nearby park, something they hadn't done in a while. The air was soft with late spring warmth, the kind that carries the scent of lilacs and pavement and something that feels like memory. They sat on their favorite bench, one that looked out over the duck pond, and watched the water move in slow, lazy ripples. Children laughed nearby. An older couple passed hand in hand. Diane was quiet at first, then said, "Mom, do you think people really change?" Naomi thought about that. "I think people are capable of it," she said. "If they're willing to listen and to stay uncomfortable long enough to learn." Diane nodded slowly. "I think I'm still learning how not to disappear when people expect me to." Naomi turned to her. "You didn't disappear that night. You stood there, and you saw everything. That takes more strength than most people realize." Diane looked down at her hands. "I used to think being strong meant being loud or fighting back." Naomi smiled. "Sometimes it does, but other times it means standing still, letting them see who you are, and refusing to shrink." Diane didn't say anything for a moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something," she said. "For school. They asked what leadership means to us." Naomi unfolded the page, expecting something short, but it was longer, handwritten, careful, every line full of thought. Diane had written about her mother, not as a CEO, but as a woman who walked into a room that didn't want her there and left it better without ever raising her voice. She wrote about how strength isn't always loud, and leadership isn't always about being first. Sometimes, it's about being last to speak, but first to act when no one is watching. Naomi finished reading, and her throat tightened. "May I keep this?" she asked softly. Diane nodded. "You're the reason I could write it." The sun dipped lower. A breeze stirred the water. Naomi placed the paper gently into her handbag, next to the note from the busser at Barbetta, next to Diane's speech, next to all the small tokens of grace she had quietly collected since that night. She didn't know what the future would look like, but she knew what her legacy would be made of. Not buildings or brands, but moments. The kind that ripple forward through time, changing things not all at once, but forever. Back at Barbetta. A new plaque had been mounted discreetly near the entrance. Not flashy, not branded, just simple words etched in brass. All are welcome here. No assumptions, no exceptions. The Ellis standard. Most guests passed it without a second glance, but some stopped. Some read it twice, and for those who had ever been turned away, overlooked, or made to feel invisible, it meant everything. Months later, at a leadership summit hosted in Washington, D.C., Naomi was invited to speak. She almost declined, but Diane encouraged her. "Just tell the truth," she said. Naomi stood on that stage, in a room filled with policymakers, executives, and educators. She didn't talk about her firm. She didn't mention profits or metrics. She told a story about a dinner that never happened, a daughter who asked why, and the quiet decision not to let that moment pass without meaning. "Sometimes," she said to the room, "we don't need to raise our voices to be heard. We just need to hold our ground long enough for the silence to speak for us." When she finished, there was no roaring applause, just stillness, reverence, the kind that follows truth spoken with clarity, the kind that doesn't fade. That night, as Naomi and Diane returned to their hotel, they walked through the lobby hand in hand. No stares, no second glances, just a mother and daughter moving through the world on their own terms. And somewhere, deep inside Naomi's heart, she knew. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of 1,000 others. Thank you for listening to this story of quiet strength, dignity, and transformation. If it touched your heart, please leave a comment, give this video a like, and share it with someone who believes in grace over noise. And remember, sometimes, the most powerful change begins with how we choose to stand still. We'll see you in the next story.